Welcome to Hub Hits. I'm Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm grateful to be joined today by Alan Kessel, a former Assistant Deputy Minister and legal advisor to the Government of Canada and Deputy High Commissioner of Canada to the United Kingdom. He's also a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a leading scholar and thinker on Canadian foreign policy in general and Canada's relationship with Israel in particular. Alan, thanks so much for joining me.
I'm delighted to be here.
We're speaking the morning of May 22nd, and I understand that you and others from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute will be soon going to Israel. Talk about the purpose of the trip and what you're hoping to get out of it.
Well, as you know, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute is heavily involved in the issue of the Israel situation, and particularly the Hamas-Israel hostilities. They're also interested in issues related to anti-Semitism, and particularly what's going on in Canada and abroad. So one of the things, certainly as a scholar and as a commentator, it's good to be on the ground speaking to people who are involved. And we intend to speak to a vast swath of various groups, including Christians, Muslims, and Druze. And I'm hoping that this will give us an opportunity to come back with a much better understanding of what is going on there.
Yes. It couldn't be more timely, Alan. Of course, just this week, Prime Minister Carney opted to sign on to a joint statement along with the Brits and the French condemning the Israeli government's offensive into Gaza and threatening action on the part of the Canadian government if the Israelis didn't reverse course. You've criticized the Carney government's decision to join that statement. Why?
I think this is the wrong time to be criticizing Israel. In fact, I find it rather reprehensible for the UK, France, and Canada to be saying this at this time. I think it's giving a freebie to Hamas, an international terrorist group, hostage taker, killed 8 Canadians. And this is not the time to be giving them something that gives them hope that somehow the West is really turning in their favor. I would have hoped that they would say different things. I would have hoped that they would actually say, the first part of it would be to say, we are 100% behind Israel in its international legal right to defend itself. I would have hoped they would call for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages.
Yes.
And that their continued captivity is a violation of international law and affront to human dignity. Clearly, Canada is aware of suffering in Gaza, but we should also understand where that suffering came from. This didn't come from Israel. And I think there's a mistake calling it the Israel-Gaza war. It should be called the Hamas-Israel war. Remember what happened on the 7th of October in 23. We should not, this is the second time that Canada has got a thank you from Hamas for what we've done. I mean, isn't it ironic? Wouldn't you say to yourself, when you see in the papers or elsewhere, or Hamas sends you a lovely little message saying, hi, thank you, Canada, for being so helpful. Wouldn't you ask yourself that as a designated terrorist organization in our country, we're getting thanks from those? Don't you want to ask yourself, is your policy sideways, upside down? I certainly would. And I think that there probably are people in government who are saying, this getting thank you is not a good idea. What I do think also is this kind of line in their statement, which they say, if you don't behave, Israel, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. I mean, this entity, this conglomeration of land, which is not governed by the same people, is running a terrorist war against a democracy. How could you recognize that as a state? Why wouldn't you recognize Taiwan? They're more of a state than anyone else.
Yeah, well said. Alan, you mentioned some of the underlying legalities here, which of course is a line of argument used by critics of Israel, which is to say that Israel is prosecuting or perpetuating a genocide, that its actions find it offside international law. You ostensibly aren't persuaded by those arguments. What are those who are making them getting wrong?
Well, first of all, anyone who understands the bases of international law can see that this is not a genocide. If there was a genocide with its full living up to its full definition in the Genocide Convention, you'd be calling what Hamas did a genocide. But clearly Hamas is a terrorist organization and not a party to the Genocide Convention. Hamas has in its charter the complete destruction of Israel, and not only Israel, but Jews. So take a look at the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention, and the irony, of course, of the Genocide Convention came out of the Second World War when the Holocaust tried to destroy, the entire Jewish population. And Raphael Lemkin, who, a Jewish Polish lawyer, actually devised the term. And what we're seeing now is a watering down of the term genocide. Anytime someone wants to say something horrible, they call it a genocide. And the reality is, genocide needs an intent to destroy. And I think we've not seen an intent to destroy on the part of Israel. On the contrary, we've seen an intent to destroy by Hamas and certain other neighbors in that environment. So I would suggest that there's a kind of a willy-nilly approach to deciding what is genocide and isn't. Our government should not fall into that trap. I know they have remarkable lawyers who can tell them what genocide is and what it isn't. And they should also be looking at what is going on here. There are two existential battles going on in our environment today. One is the Ukraine-Russia situation, where a vile dictatorship with no scruples attacked a democracy with Western values. And we have Israel, where a vile terrorist group with no scruples attacked a democracy. And in both those cases, they were an attack on the West and the Western values. And what Israel and Ukraine are doing are fighting our war, because it's only a matter of time if the Russians are appeased in Ukraine, and if Hamas and other groups are appeased in the Middle East, that we will be fighting in Europe and in those other areas. So I think we need to wake up and understand what's going on and not be bullied by either scenes or guilt into thinking that we shouldn't be taking care of our interests. And our interests coincide with our values today. We should be standing up for our values, and those values would say to us, support the good guys. And the good guys are the Israelis here, and the good guys are the Ukrainians. Because the alternative, if you spend 15 minutes over your coffee to think about the alternative, is not very pretty.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. There's a tendency in a lot of commentary to attribute a complexity to these questions. And of course, they're complicated and there are different ways to think about them. But I often joke, only partly facetiously, that I'm also inclined to trust the common sense of my grandfather in Thunder Bay, who I think pretty clearly could see who the good guys and who the bad guys are. That, of course, doesn't determine one's policy, but it's a pretty good starting point. But before we wrap up, Alan, we'll come to how some of these issues are playing out in Canada, because I know that's something that concerns you and will indeed be part of your trip in the coming days. But as someone who's worked for a long time, 40 years in the public service, has served governments of different political stripes, I want to ask you about how the government of Canada as an institution thinks about Canada's relationship with Israel. I think there's a tendency to attribute Canadian policy to the different preferences and presumptions of the political arm of the government. But of course, the government of Canada itself is representative of the different perspectives and views of the people who work for it. How would you characterize the center of gravity in the Department of Foreign Affairs vis-a-vis Canada's relationship with Israel? And to what extent is the Carney government's decision, for instance, to sign on to this statement a reflection or rejection of that center of gravity?
Well, I mean, that's a very interesting and possibly a quite difficult question. I think clearly, as a professional public servant, your commitment is to the government of the day. And regardless of what my political views, whether the ones I'm stating now or others, when you sign on to government, you should be actually providing the best advice possible to the government of the day. You do not have a political interest. What you do have is the obligation to provide fearless advice and then loyal implementation. And so that's what we hope that most of the public service does. I can speak for foreign affairs, global affairs, external affairs. It transmogrifies depending on who's in power. But the reality is that we have a very professional foreign service, and we have professional people in government. Do I believe that history and inclination has encouraged a more Arabist view within the Foreign Service because you have a more left of center crowd who are hired from universities and think tanks? And I absolutely do. You can't ignore Israel, and so we don't ignore Israel. You can't ignore the fact that it's the startup nation. It's the place where so much ingenuity is being emanated from. But I think there's a bit of a grudging awareness of that. I would hope that my colleagues aren't anti-Semitic. I would hope that the people I worked with value that relationship. And certainly face to face, they would tell you they do. I think the proof is in the pudding. And I would hope that the advice being given to Mr. Carney, both from Minister Anand and the team at Global Affairs, and certainly the people in his office, is one that actually reflects on what our interests are. I worry that Canada is moving from G7 to G-Wiz. And the problem is, are we the irrelevant in the room? We have thought we are leaders, but we aren't. And if you take a look right now at where we are in the world, we're totally isolated. They used to be our best friends. Now they're just our closest friends. Europeans are so busy dealing with the realities of Russia and bad decisions by Merkel on oil and gas, when it should have been Canadian oil and gas. The other friends, the Australians and the New Zealanders, are desperately trying to be Asian. And we don't know who we are. I mean, the last prime minister couldn't even describe what a Canadian was. At least we have an adult in the room right now with Mr. Carney. And I hope that Mr. Carney, in his pursuit of putting Canada back on the map, actually sticks to those values and those interests. Because I think history will be a cruel cruel judge if he doesn't. I mean, what he's done, the irony is, in dealing with the Hamas situation as he is right now, he's listening to people who say, we don't want a two-state solution, we want a no-Jew state solution. And if you can't hear that, you're deaf. And what is happening is that reflection of deafness is playing out on the streets of Canada. What's happening on the streets of Canada is we're seeing a rampant anti-Semitism. We're seeing a vile violence against Jews, desecration of synagogues, shooting at girls' schools, and people on the street who are covered. I mean, this is unbelievable, covering their faces and uttering death threats. We need a wake-up call in this country at all levels of government. They're not playing by the same rules. This is not, small-town Ontario. This is geostrategic realpolitik. And, we've just got to get out of our own comfort zone and understand that, because otherwise we'll be swept away by history.
Yeah, just a ton of insight in that answer, Alan. I want to wrap up on the subject that you closed with there, and that is the extent to which we are seeing these issues play out on our campuses and indeed on our streets. I mentioned that we're speaking the morning of May 22nd. Of course, we all woke up to news that two Israelis were murdered last night at a Jewish event in Washington. And I don't think we should take for granted that something like that couldn't happen in our own country. In fact, it may only be a matter of when, not if. Talk a bit about what we've seen play out in Canada in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks and Israel's subsequent military operation. Is this something that has surprised you? And either way, how should we be thinking about this ideology in our midst?
Listen, the thing that surprised me that was how quickly we threw our values out the window when it came to the murder, rape, violation um, of citizens of Israel when women's groups remained silent. It took some women's groups 7 weeks. UN women didn't say anything for 7 weeks. Where's the concept of we believe women when they're raped? I was just at the Nova exhibition in Toronto, which is a must-see, I think. In fact, I would suggest that before the Nova exhibition is over, that the Prime Minister himself and his cabinet to go for a walk through there to get a real sense of what the pain that was caused to the Israeli psyche. And last night I went to an event where John and Rachel Goldberg-Poland, whose son Hirsch was murdered after 300 odd days in a tunnel. And that is the non-expression of outrage, which is what I find abysmal in this country. There's no outrage that this is going on. What about the outrage of the 8 Canadians who were murdered, and Judy Weinstein's body is still being held hostage? Remember that after 9/11, when 24 Canadians were killed, we joined Operation Enduring Freedom with the Americans and a coalition. We flew across the globe together with other countries. We bombed the hell out of Al-Qaeda indiscriminately. We removed the Taliban in a regime change exercise. We remained in Afghanistan for 10 years plus. We lost 158 Canadians because of the 24 that died. And what did we do when 8 Canadians were murdered savagely in Israel?
Nothing.
It speaks volumes. And that has allowed the anti-Semitism on our street. That has given license to people to think that it's okay. You know, when you're giving Timbits to terrorists on the Avenue Road exit on the 401 in Toronto, when you don't have a mayor of Toronto who comes out strongly and speaks on this issue, when you don't have a federal government or a prime minister that walks in marches and says, this is not going to happen. Not that this doesn't represent us, these mealy-mouthed words. This is not Canada. Well, actually, it is Canada. Wake up, Canada.
Alan Kessel, former Assistant Deputy Minister and Legal Advisor to the Government of Canada, Deputy High Commissioner of Canada to the United Kingdom, and of course, a Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, where he's doing some big thinking and writing on these topics. What a ton of moral clarity and insight you've shared with us today here at Hub Hits. I hope to have you back on soon to talk about these issues, amongst others. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was a delight to be here. Thanks.